December 11th, 1944, Eastern Belgium. Sergeant Frank Kowalski grips the steering wheel of his GMC CCKW as fog rolls across the Ardennes forest. Behind him, 6 more trucks carry ammunition, medical supplies, and rations for the 99th Infantry Division. The convoy should have taken the main highway. Instead, Kowalski has led them onto a dirt logging road that barely fits 2 vehicles side by side. His co-driver, Private Jensen, keeps glancing at the map, then at Kowalski, then back at the map. Jensen doesn't say it, but his expression screams the question, why are we taking the long way when men are waiting for these supplies? Kowalski downshifts as the truck climbs a muddy incline. Tree branches scrape against the canvas cover. The official route would have gotten them to the front line in 2 hours. This back road will take 4, maybe 5 if the weather gets worse. But Kowalski doesn't change course. He's been driving supply runs for 8 months now, and he's developed a pattern that doesn't match any manual or doctrine. Other drivers think he's paranoid. Some call him slow. A few have reported him for wasting fuel and time. What none of them know is that right now, at this exact moment, German reconnaissance units are setting up ambush positions along that main highway. In 6 hours, 3 Allied supply convoys will drive straight into those kill zones. 42 men will die. 17 trucks will burn. Critical supplies meant for units preparing to face the coming German offensive will never arrive. Kowalski doesn't know about the ambush either. He doesn't have intelligence reports or radio warnings. What he has is a pattern he's built from watching roads, studying wreckage, and paying attention to things other drivers ignore. And that pattern is about to save lives in ways nobody will fully understand until much later. The problem facing Allied logistics in late 1944 is brutal in its simplicity. You need to move supplies from rear depots to frontline units. The front line keeps moving. The enemy knows where your roads are, and every truck you lose means soldiers go without ammunition, food, or medical care. The U.S. Army is moving approximately 800,000 tons of supplies per month through France and Belgium. That requires roughly 240,000 truck trips. The Germans can't stop all of them, but they don't need to. If they can destroy just 5% of convoys on critical routes, they can create gaps in supply chains that cascade into real combat problems. Standard doctrine says you protect convoys with speed and volume. Move fast, move in groups, use the best roads. The logic seems sound. Highway 64 between Liège and Malmedy can handle 30 trucks per hour. A dirt logging road handles maybe 6. If you're running hundreds of convoys per day, efficiency matters. Every hour you save multiplies across the entire supply network. So doctrine pushes drivers onto main routes, keeps them moving fast, and accepts losses as inevitable friction of war. But here's what doctrine doesn't account for. Predictability creates vulnerability. When you always use the fastest route, the enemy knows exactly where to wait. When you move in large convoys, you create one big target instead of many small ones. When you prioritize speed over awareness, you drive straight into situations you could have avoided. By December 1944, the Germans have been studying Allied supply patterns for months. They know which roads carry the most traffic. They know convoy spacing, typical speeds, times of day when movement peaks. They've figured out that American trucks usually travel in groups of 5 to 12 vehicles, maintaining roughly 100 yards between gaps, moving at speeds between 25 and 35 miles per hour on good roads. This predictability lets small German units achieve disproportionate results. A squad with a single anti-tank gun and some small arms can destroy or disable multiple trucks if they pick the right spot and timing. The U.S. Army knows this is happening. Intelligence reports document dozens of convoy ambushes across the European theater, but the proposed solutions all follow the same logic. More escorts, more armor, more firepower. Some convoys now travel with jeeps mounted with 50 caliber machine guns. Others have armored cars leading and trailing the column. The problem is that escorts don't eliminate ambushes. They just make ambushes more costly for both sides. And escorts require resources. Every jeep escorting a convoy is a jeep not doing reconnaissance or carrying messages or performing the 100 other tasks armies need. If you're finding this tactical breakdown interesting, hit that subscribe button. We analyze the small decisions that changed big battles every week. Frank Kowalski offers a different answer, though he never articulates it as doctrine or policy. He's 29 years old, from Pennsylvania, worked as a regional truck driver before the war. His job was delivering machine parts to factories scattered across 3 states. He learned backroads because main highways meant toll booths and way stations and traffic. He learned to read terrain because a wrong turn could add 50 miles to a route. He learned that the fastest path on a map isn't always the fastest path in reality when you factor in conditions, congestion, and risk. When the Army made him a truck driver, all that knowledge came with him, but the Army didn't want that knowledge. The Army wanted drivers who followed convoy procedures, maintained proper spacing, and stayed on assigned routes. Kowalski tried that for his first 2 months in theater. He drove the highways, followed the trucks ahead of him, arrived at destinations in the times the schedules predicted. He also drove past burned-out wrecks on those highways. He saw bodies covered with tarps waiting for graves registration. He watched recovery crews winch destroyed trucks off roads to clear traffic. Something about those wrecks bothers him, not the fact that they exist. War produces wreckage. What bothers him is where they exist. The same curves, the same intersections, the same stretches of road where forest closes in on both sides. He starts keeping a mental map of ambush sites. After his 7th convoy run, he realizes he can predict where the next ambushes will likely occur. The pattern isn't complicated. Germans hit spots where convoys have to slow down, where sight lines are limited, where the terrain offers concealment for attackers and no easy escape for trucks. In October, Kowalski makes his first unauthorized route change. He's supposed to take Highway 64 to deliver ammunition to an artillery unit, but Highway 64 runs through a valley with steep wooded slopes on both sides for 3 miles. Every instinct from his civilian driving days screams trap, so he takes a logging road that parallels the highway but stays on higher ground. The detour adds 90 minutes to his journey. His commanding officer chews him out for being late. The artillery unit logs a complaint about delayed supply delivery. 2 days later, a convoy of 9 trucks takes Highway 64 through that same valley. German infantry with Panzerfausts hit them from both slopes. 5 trucks destroyed, 14 men killed. The road stays closed for 8 hours while engineers clear the wreckage. Kowalski hears about it in the motor pool. He doesn't say anything. What would he say? That he had a bad feeling about a road? That his civilian driving experience told him not to trust that terrain? Nobody wants to hear that kind of reasoning. But Kowalski keeps making changes, small ones at first. He varies his departure times instead of leaving at the scheduled hour. He takes different routes to the same destinations, rotating through 3 or 4 options. He drives slower than doctrine recommends, but maintains better awareness of his surroundings. When he has a choice between a fast exposed road and a slow covered one, he takes the cover. Other drivers notice. Some ask him why he's always on back roads. He gives vague answers about road conditions or traffic. A few drivers start following his example, taking alternate routes, varying their patterns. Most stick with standard procedures. The motor pool sergeant calls Kowalski into his office in November. The conversation is blunt. Stop wasting fuel on unnecessary detours. Stop arriving late. Stop making other drivers question established procedures. Kowalski tries to explain his reasoning, but it sounds weak even to his own ears. He can't point to intelligence reports or official warnings. He's basing his decisions on gut instinct and pattern recognition from a civilian job. The sergeant isn't interested. Follow the assigned routes or face disciplinary action. Clear enough. December comes and brings worse weather with it. Snow, fog, freezing rain. Road conditions deteriorate across the entire sector. Main highways become treacherous. The advantage of paved roads shrinks when those roads are covered in ice. Suddenly, Kowalski's backroad navigation skills matter more. He knows which dirt roads drain better, which forest trails stay passable in mud, which routes have gentler grades that trucks can handle in snow. Commanders start requesting him specifically for difficult runs, not because they believe in his tactical reasoning. They still think he's just a cautious driver, but because he gets through when conditions are bad. In the first week of December, Kowalski completes 11 supply runs to forward positions. 10 of them use routes he's personally scouted. None encounter enemy action. He's not the only driver running supplies, of course. Dozens of others are making runs on standard routes, and several of those convoys get hit. Yet, records suggest that between December 1st and December 10th, German forces conduct at least 18 successful ambushes against Allied supply convoys in the Ardennes sector. The attacks follow a consistent pattern. Small German units, usually between 8 and 15 men, position themselves at vulnerable points along main supply routes. They wait for convoys to enter kill zones, then strike with a combination of anti-tank weapons, machine guns, and small arms. The attacks are quick. Most last less than 15 minutes. The Germans destroy or disable what they can, then withdraw before Allied forces can respond in strength. The loss rate isn't catastrophic from a strategic perspective. Allied logistics can absorb these losses and keep functioning, but the cumulative effect matters. 43 trucks destroyed or damaged in 10 days, 67 men killed or wounded. Supplies lost include ammunition, medical equipment, fuel, and food. Some units experienced delays in receiving critical materials. The attacks also force Allied forces to divert resources to convoy protection, pulling troops and vehicles away from other tasks. Intelligence officers analyze the ambush patterns and reach a conclusion that seems obvious. The Germans are exploiting Allied predictability. They're watching the main highways, noting convoy movements, and setting up attacks where conditions favor the ambush. The solution, according to these officers, is to make convoys less predictable. Vary the routes, change the timing, mix up the procedures. In other words, do exactly what Kowalski has been doing for weeks. But turning that concept into actual policy proves difficult. The Army runs on systems and schedules. Supply officers need to know when trucks will arrive so they can coordinate unloading and distribution. Maintenance crews need to know which roads convoys are using so they can provide recovery support if trucks break down. Military police need to know convoy routes so they can direct traffic and provide security. When you make every convoy follow a unique, unpredictable route, you sacrifice coordination and efficiency. So the official solution becomes a compromise. Convoys can request alternate routes if conditions warrant. Drivers receive authorization to make tactical detours if they observe suspicious activity. But the default remains the established highway network with scheduled departure times. Most drivers continue following standard procedures because that's what the system expects and rewards. Kowalski's pattern, meanwhile, keeps working. His December 11th run through the logging roads is typical of his approach. The official route would have taken Highway 64 east from Liège, then Highway 32 south toward the 99th Division's positions. Total distance, 48 miles. Estimated time, 2 hours and 15 minutes. Kowalski's route uses a combination of logging roads, farm tracks, and minor paved roads that wind through the forest. Total distance, 63 miles. Actual time, 4 hours and 30 minutes. On paper, it looks like a massive waste of resources. He's burning more fuel, taking twice as long, and adding wear to his truck on rough terrain. But what the paper doesn't show is the threat assessment. Highway 64 passes through 2 areas where ambushes have occurred in the past week. Highway 32 includes a bridge that's an obvious choke point. Kowalski's route avoids both. It keeps his convoy in areas where the terrain is less favorable for ambushes, and where German reconnaissance is less likely to be watching. The 6 trucks behind him aren't all volunteers for this approach. 2 of the drivers are new replacements who don't know Kowalski's reputation yet. They're just following the lead truck because that's what you do in a convoy. 1 driver is nervous about the route, but trusts Kowalski's experience. The other 3 have driven with him before, and specifically requested to be in his convoy. They've noticed that Kowalski's trucks don't get shot at. Private Jensen, riding in the co-driver seat, is still uncomfortable with the whole thing. He's been with Kowalski for 3 weeks now. He's seen the backroad pattern in action. He's also heard the complaints from other drivers and the criticism from officers who think Kowalski is being overcautious. Jensen is 19 years old, from Iowa, has been in Europe for 6 weeks. Everything is still new and confusing. He wants to follow the rules because rules provide structure in chaos. Kowalski's approach feels like improvisation, and improvisation feels dangerous. They're 2 hours into the run when Jensen finally speaks up. Why not just take the highway? The weather isn't that bad. The truck is handling fine. They could make up time, get these supplies to the front before dark. Kowalski doesn't answer immediately. He's navigating a curve where the logging road narrows between 2 large trees. When the road straightens out, he glances at Jensen. He says something like this: "You can take the fast road and maybe get there quick, or you can take the slow road and definitely get there alive. I choose alive every time." Jensen wants to push back, wants to argue that they're wasting time, but something in Kowalski's tone stops him. This isn't bravado or paranoia, it's calculation. Kowalski has thought through the odds and made his decision based on what he thinks gives them the best chance of survival. Jensen looks out the window at the dense forest passing by and realizes that if someone wanted to ambush them on this narrow road, it would be almost impossible. There's no clear line of sight for more than 50 yards in any direction. The trees are too thick for vehicles to approach from the sides. An ambush would require the Germans to be physically standing on this specific road at this specific time, which seems unlikely. On the highway, by contrast, there are dozens of spots where an attacker could see them coming from hundreds of yards away and have time to prepare. Jensen doesn't say it out loud, but he starts to understand Kowalski's logic. It's not about the road being safe, it's about the road being unpredictable. And unpredictability is its own form of protection. They reached the 99th Division's supply point at 1640 hours, nearly 3 hours behind schedule. The supply sergeant is annoyed but not surprised. Kowalski has been late before. The unloading takes 40 minutes. Ammunition crates, medical supplies, ration boxes. Everything gets checked off the manifest. Kowalski signs the paperwork, makes sure his trucks are ready for the return trip, and heads back to the motor pool using a completely different route than the one he took coming in. That evening, word spreads through the motor pool about the 3 convoys that got hit on Highway 64. 42 men dead, 17 trucks destroyed. The attacks happened throughout the afternoon at 3 different locations along the same highway. German units had apparently positioned themselves at multiple ambush sites, creating a gauntlet that caught several convoys. The highway is now closed indefinitely while combat engineers clear the area and infantry sweeps the flanking terrain. December 16th. 1944, the Germans launch Operation Watch on the Rhine, what will become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, smash into a thinly defended sector of the American line in the Ardennes. The attack comes as a strategic surprise. Intelligence had predicted the Germans were too weak for a major offensive. Instead, they've gathered enough strength for one last desperate gamble aimed at splitting the Allied armies and capturing the vital supply port of Antwerp. The offensive creates immediate chaos across the entire region. Front lines collapse or become confused. Communication breaks down. Units find themselves cut off or surrounded. And supply lines, the arteries keeping Allied forces functioning, come under massive pressure. Roads that were relatively secure 2 days ago now run through contested territory. Depots that were safely behind the lines suddenly find German tanks approaching. The entire logistics network has to adapt to a completely new situation in real time. This is where Kowalski's pattern becomes more than just one driver's personal approach. It becomes a template for survival in chaos. When the main highways are cut or compromised, the back roads matter. When you can't predict where German forces are, unpredictability in your own movements becomes essential. When every convoy might run into enemy action, the ability to navigate alternate routes determines who gets through and who doesn't. Kowalski is at the motor pool when the offensive begins. He's been off duty for 18 hours, sleeping after a long run the previous day. Someone shakes him awake with news that sounds impossible. German breakthrough, multiple sectors. Orders are to prepare for emergency supply runs to units that are trying to establish defensive positions. Nobody knows exactly where those positions are yet or which roads are safe. The situation is changing minute by minute. Within 3 hours, Kowalski is back in his truck leading a convoy of 8 vehicles toward the 2nd Infantry Division, which is reportedly setting up a defensive line near a town called Elsenborn Ridge. The official route would take Highway 32 south, but reports indicate German forces have been spotted near that highway. Nobody knows if it's accurate intelligence or panic. Kowalski doesn't wait to find out. He takes a route that swings east through forest roads, adding 15 miles but staying away from the main German axis of advance. His convoy gets through. 2 other convoys attempting to reach the same units that day don't. One runs into a German roadblock and has to turn back after losing 3 trucks. Another gets caught in an ambush that destroys half the vehicles and scatters the rest. Kowalski's convoy delivers critical ammunition and medical supplies to units that are about to face sustained German attacks. Those supplies matter, not enough to change the strategic picture, but enough to help those specific units hold their ground for the next 72 hours. Over the following week, as the Battle of the Bulge intensifies, supply operations become increasingly desperate and dangerous. The Germans control or threaten major roads throughout the salient. Allied units are scattered and often encircled. Getting supplies through requires drivers who can navigate chaos, find alternate routes, and make real-time decisions about risk versus necessity. This is exactly the skill set Kowalski has been developing for months. He runs 6 emergency supply missions between December 16th and December 23rd. 4 of them use routes that aren't on any official map. He navigates by memory, local knowledge gathered from Belgian civilians, and educated guesses about terrain. On one run, he uses a farm road that's barely wide enough for his truck and has to personally guide each vehicle through a stream ford because there's no bridge. The detour takes them miles out of their way, but avoids a German panzer unit that's blocking the main road. On December 19th, he's tasked with delivering medical supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. This should be impossible. The town is completely encircled by German forces, but Kowalski studies the maps and finds a possible route through the southern approach using back roads and forest trails. He takes just 2 trucks instead of a full convoy to reduce noise and visibility. They travel at night without headlights, navigating by moonlight and memory. The route takes them within a mile of German positions. At one point, they can hear German vehicles moving on a parallel road. Kowalski stops his convoy, kills the engine, and waits in silence for 20 minutes while German trucks pass in the distance. When the sounds fade, he starts moving again. They reach a point where American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne have established a thin defensive perimeter. The medical supplies get through. The trucks make it back out before dawn using a different route. That mission becomes a legend in the motor pool. Drivers who previously dismissed Kowalski as overcautious now want to learn from him. Officers who criticized his route deviations now seek his advice on supply planning. The motor pool sergeant who threatened him with disciplinary action now assigns him the most difficult and dangerous runs because he has the best chance of completing them. But here's what's important to understand. Kowalski's success isn't magic, and it isn't just skill. It's also luck, and it comes with costs. His approach works because he's willing to take more time, use more fuel, and push his equipment harder on rough terrain. His trucks require more maintenance because backroads tear up vehicles faster than highways. His delivery times are unpredictable, which creates problems for supply officers trying to coordinate logistics. And his pattern can't scale to the entire transportation network. The U.S. Army in the Ardennes needs hundreds of trucks, moving thousands of tons of supplies every day. If every driver took Kowalski's approach, the system would collapse under its own inefficiency. You can't run a modern military supply network on improvisation and backroads. You need standardized routes, schedules, and procedures. What Kowalski offers isn't a replacement for that system. It's a supplement for situations where the system breaks down. Military authorities study what Kowalski is doing. After the battle, logistics officers interview him extensively. They want to understand his decision-making process, codify it into doctrine, teach it to other drivers. But when they try to break down his pattern into steps and rules, something gets lost. Kowalski's approach depends on constant adaptation, personal judgment, and accepting uncertainty. Those qualities resist standardization. What they do learn: varying routes matters more than they thought. The Germans are exploiting Allied predictability more effectively than intelligence had realized. Small unit ambushes are destroying disproportionate amounts of supplies. Drivers need more authority to make tactical decisions about routes and timing. Convoys should be smaller and more dispersed. The fastest route isn't always the best route when you factor in risk. May 1945. Germany surrenders. The combat phase of the European War concludes. Supply convoys no longer face the threat of ambush. The roads are secure. The backroad pattern that kept Kowalski's trucks untouched becomes unnecessary overnight. Within weeks, the Army returns to standard procedures focused purely on efficiency. Trucks use the main highways. Convoys run on fixed schedules. The improvisational approach that worked during combat gives way to the systematic approach that works during peacetime. Kowalski musters out of the Army in November 1945 and returns to Pennsylvania. He goes back to truck driving, working for the same company that employed him before the war. His job is essentially identical to what it was in 1941, delivering machine parts to factories across 3 states. The roads are the same, the trucks are similar, but he's different. He's driven through combat zones, navigated under threat of death, seen what happens when patterns become predictable. He applies his wartime experience to civilian driving, but in less dramatic ways. He still uses backroads when main highways are congested. He still varies his routes and timing to avoid predictability, though now he's avoiding traffic cops and way stations rather than ambushes. He still studies terrain and thinks about sight lines and choke points. The skills remain useful even when the stakes drop from life and death to merely professional. But here's what's interesting about the longer-term impact. Kowalski's pattern doesn't vanish with the war. Other drivers who learned from him carry those lessons into their post-war careers. Some become truck drivers in civilian industry. Others go into logistics and transportation planning. A few stay in the military and eventually reach positions where they influence doctrine. The idea that unpredictability can be a tactical advantage, that backroads matter, that local knowledge beats standardized procedure in certain situations. These concepts spread through professional communities in ways that are hard to trace but real nonetheless. Military historians eventually study supply operations during the Battle of the Bulge and identify Kowalski's approach as a case study in adaptive logistics. His record of completed missions without losses becomes a data point in analyses of convoy vulnerability. But the historians also note the limitations. They point out that his success depended on specific conditions, relatively small-scale operations, personal experience with the local terrain, situations where the system had broken down enough that improvisation was accepted. Those conditions don't always exist. In modern military logistics, the tension between efficiency and unpredictability remains unresolved. GPS and satellite communication have made navigation easier, but they've also made convoys more trackable. Improvised explosive devices and asymmetric warfare have made predictable routes even more dangerous. The basic problem Kowalski faced, how do you move supplies through hostile territory when the enemy knows your patterns, hasn't gone away. It's just evolved into new forms with new technologies on both sides. Some military training programs now include scenarios that explicitly teach the principles Kowalski discovered through experience. Drivers learn to vary routes, change timing, avoid establishing patterns that enemies can exploit. They study terrain analysis and threat assessment. They practice making real-time decisions about risk versus mission requirements. But there's always a gap between training scenarios and actual combat. Kowalski didn't learn his pattern from a manual or a classroom. He learned it from watching where trucks burned, from surviving when others didn't, from trusting his instincts even when doctrine said otherwise. That gap between formal knowledge and experiential knowledge matters. You can teach someone to read a map and identify vulnerable terrain. You can train them to follow procedures for alternate routing, but you can't easily teach the judgment that tells you when to trust your gut over your orders, when to take the slow road instead of the fast one, when to accept inefficiency in exchange for survival. That's wisdom, and wisdom comes from experience in ways that resist standardization. Looking back at Kowalski's record, what stands out isn't just that he avoided ambushes, it's that he avoided them through a pattern that seemed inefficient and paranoid, until suddenly, it was the only thing that worked. During normal conditions, his approach looked wasteful. During crisis, it looked essential. The challenge for any organization, military or civilian, is maintaining the flexibility to allow approaches like Kowalski's even when they don't fit neatly into standard procedures. This gets at something deeper about how knowledge moves through organizations. Official doctrine evolves slowly through formal channels, studies, reports, revised manuals, training programs. But practical knowledge often spreads faster through informal networks, experienced people teaching newer people, stories told in motor pools and barracks, patterns copied because they're observed to work. Kowalski never wrote a manual on convoy tactics. He probably couldn't have articulated his full decision-making process if you asked him to, but other drivers watched what he did and learned from it anyway. The historical record shows that convoy losses in Kowalski's sector decreased notably in the months after December 1944, even as the overall tactical situation remained dangerous. Some of that decrease resulted from changing German capabilities as their forces weakened, but some of it came from American drivers adopting more flexible approaches to routing and timing. They learned from what worked. They adapted to what the situation required. That kind of decentralized learning doesn't show up clearly in after-action reports, but it affects outcomes nonetheless. By war's end, approximately 680 American transportation trucks were destroyed by enemy action in the European theater during the final 6 months of combat. That number could have been higher, it could have been lower, but each truck that made it through carried supplies that kept units fighting, medical equipment that saved lives, food that sustained soldiers. Each driver who learned to vary patterns, read terrain, and trust their judgment increased those odds fractionally. Multiply those fractional improvements across thousands of missions, and the cumulative impact becomes significant. Kowalski's contribution wasn't revolutionary. He didn't invent a new weapon system or winning strategy. He just drove trucks more carefully than doctrine required, and more adaptively than regulations preferred. He survived situations where others died. He delivered supplies that kept units operational, and he demonstrated that sometimes the most important tactical advantage isn't firepower or speed or technology. It's simply being harder to predict than your enemy expects. The GMC CCKW trucks that Kowalski drove are museum pieces now. The roads of the Ardennes, where he navigated his backroad pattern, are peaceful highways and farm routes. The urgency that made his pattern necessary has faded into history, but the fundamental principle remains relevant. When someone is trying to hurt you and they know your patterns, The solution isn't always to be stronger or faster. Sometimes the solution is just to be somewhere they're not expecting. That lesson applies beyond military logistics. It applies to any situation where you face opposition that studies your behavior and exploits your predictability. Cybersecurity professionals understand it. Don't follow the same procedures every time. Athletes understand it. Don't let opponents predict your next move. Business strategists understand it. Don't let competitors know exactly what you're doing before you do it. Kowalski probably didn't think about any of that while he was driving through Belgian forests in December 1944. He was just trying to stay alive and do his job. He found a pattern that worked for him in that specific situation. The fact that the pattern turned out to have broader applications and longer-term relevance wasn't part of his plan. He was solving an immediate tactical problem with tools and knowledge he happened to have available. But that's often how effective tactics emerge, not from grand strategic planning sessions, but from individuals adapting to problems they face right now with whatever resources they can access. The challenge for institutions is recognizing those adaptations when they work and understanding when to adopt them more broadly. The military struggled with that during the war. They saw what Kowalski was doing. They documented it. They tried to systematize it. But they never fully resolved the tension between his flexible approach and their need for standardized procedures.